Ware. You're watching Transforming Transportation 2021. Welcome to day 2 of the conference. For the next 1 hour and 15 minutes, we are going to be talking about financial resilience across a whole range of modes of transport. It is a conversation that we all should be invested in. I know that you're going to find out some details that will surprise you, hopefully give you hope and give you pause and inspire you if you're also working in transport. We start with Stephanie van Friedeburg. Stephanie is the COO of the International Finance Corporation. Stephanie, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Femi. Good to see you too. I am very pleased to be joining this conference at such a critical time. The transport sector has been hit hard by COVID, and it is important to explore how it can emerge from this crisis both rapidly and resiliently. The private sector can and should play a key role in igniting its recovery, and IFC, as the only global private sector development institution, is uniquely positioned to help. Let's unpack this. The magnitude of the COVID's impact on the sector has been vast. Let me use aviation and urban transport to illustrate some of the most dramatic effects of the pandemic. Aviation suffered an abrupt shutdown in 2020. With many airport fleets almost entirely grounded and airports largely closed to passenger traffic for prolonged periods. The International Air Transport Association estimates that revenue passenger kilometers, an industry metric for demand, shrunk by 66%, the largest decline since World War II. Together with this, connectivity between cities was deeply affected, reversing a century of progress in physically bringing people together. Before COVID-19, air service connected over 19,000 city pairs, but less than 7,000 pairs remain today. This has ultimately led to a liquidity crisis for the sector and to a wave of cost-cutting measures, thousands of layoffs, and in several cases, bankruptcies. According to a report from the Air Transport Action Group published last September, around 46 million jobs supported by the aviation industry were in peril. My second case, urban transport, has seen large declines in ridership as people work or study from home. For operators of the metros and buses, navigating the new reality has meant implementing new health protocols, changing routes and schedules, and reducing new investments. Loss of ridership has meant loss of revenue, which impairs the ability of operators to meet their financial and contractual obligations. For instance, in Brazil, São Paulo saw a 45% drop in demand in the subway system and a 40% reduction for buses in March and April of 2020. And these are just 2 examples, by no means exhaustive. The question then is, how do we minimize these impacts in the near term and build back a more sustainable and resilient industry in the long term? I do believe the answer lies with the private sector. Even before the crisis, the private sector had an important role to play in helping address the large transportation infrastructure gap, then estimated to be about $420 billion a year. Today, as governments face increasing fiscal constraints, the private sector has an even more instrumental role to play. The private sector can, in fact, be both the enabler and the accelerator for the critical solutions that are urgently needed. It is the private sector that can help accelerate vaccine distribution and develop the robust cold chain logistic networks necessary to reopen economies. And it is the private sector that can drive innovation and deploy new technologies and new business models to respond to the latest potentially irreversible trends. We must look no further than last mile logistics, where the adaptation of online goods and services through digital platforms as a result of the pandemic has really brought interesting new opportunities. As an example, IFC has invested in Shadowfax, an Indian-based company which has implemented contactless deliveries, allowing customers to opt for safe deliveries of meals and medicines directly to their doorsteps. The call for building back better post-COVID will also bring an introduction of profitable solutions in support of environmental sustainability. This is especially important given that transport accounts for 24% of the CO2 emissions globally. An interesting example in this space might be IFC investee Blackbuck, an Indian long-haul e-logistics player that uses technological solutions like routing algorithms to increase truckloads and load factors and limit empty runs. This helps reduce GHG emissions in a country where trucks have 33% utilization on average. I chose the IFC examples to show how IFC can be a partner of choice when it comes to supporting a more sustainable and resilient transport sector during and post-crisis. Our COVID strategy is framed around 3 R's: relief, restructuring, and recovery. In the relief phase, IFC has been committed to helping transport clients and partners with liquidity and other short-term funding needs to cover temporary liquidity shortfalls. As the crisis has been prolonged, we have seen more and more the need for refinancing and restructuring. To this end, we have been working selectively, using loans and quasi-equity to support best-in-class airlines that provide critical connectivity, as well as operators in other sectors, such as airports and roads, that have been adversely affected. We are supporting cities and other subnational entities, which are essential partners to the sustainability of urban transport. For example, in June, IFC provided funding to a city in South Africa for critical capital expenditures. Beyond relief and restructuring, IFC remains focused on supporting the transportation sector's resilient recovery in the longer run. This objective is intrinsically tied to our IFC 3.0 strategy, where we must find ways to attract investment to our countries of operation, especially the poorest and most fragile. To this end, we are continuing to scale up financing of transport through public-private partnerships. For example, we are currently advising the government of Barbados on structuring the concession for their main airport, adjusting the process to consider the impacts of the crisis on aviation. We are playing an increasing role in policy and regulatory dialogue and sector reform alongside the World Bank. We are currently providing technical advice to the Indian central government and to 2 subnational governments to encourage private investment in electric mobility and develop standard electric bus concession contracts. Finally, IFC is working with partners to pilot and de-risk new concepts in some of the world's poorest countries. Through our work on early-stage projects, we are helping create third-party temperature-controlled logistics businesses in several emerging countries, including Bangladesh. In closing, it's important to remember 3 things. First, no one can face this crisis alone, especially given the magnitude of the impact on the transport sector. Second, the private sector will be more important than ever in helping the sector rebound and rebound better. Remember, there is a limited remaining fiscal space, and the private sector can bring critical innovation. And third, IFC is here to help. We can build on years of experience working with many of you across the public and private sectors, as well as other key players, to turn this crisis into an opportunity to build back better, especially through the adaptation of cleaner and more efficient technologies. I look forward to the panel today. Thank you again, Femi.
Thank you very much. Stephanie von Friedeburg is the COO of the International Financial Corporation. Nice to have you. Thank you so much. So we are going to move on with our discussion with some leaders from transport modes across the world, talking about where they are now with their different modes of transport and where they need to get to. So bring on the panel. I want you to meet the panel. And remember that wherever you are, what platform you're on, you can reach the panel and ask your questions. I do my best to get them all in together. So let's start. Who is very close to me? I'm going to say hello to Florent. Florent, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Florent, will you tell our audience, our Transforming Transportation audience, who you are and what you do?
Yes. So my name is Florent Menegaux. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Michelin. Michelin is a tire manufacturer around the world. We are present in 174 countries in the world, and we employ 130,000 people, and we manufacture roughly 180 million tires a year.
Nice to have you. Hello, Fang. Welcome. Will you tell everybody who you are, your official title, your official duties?
Thank you, Fanny. My name is Fang Liu. I'm the Secretary General of International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, a United Nations specialized agency located and headquarters in Montreal, Canada. Our organization's main mandate is to set up standards for international civil aviation, covering airlines, airports, air navigation service providers, and all related aviation sectors services to our customers. So I'm very happy and also pleased to join this panel to discuss the recovery and resilience of our global aviation sector.
Good to have you. Hello, Francisco. Welcome to plenary number 4. Good to see you. Introduce yourself to our delegates around the world.
Thank you, Femi. Thank you, all of us. Thank you for inviting us to share our vision of what's happening here now. I'm really delighted to share this panel with all my colleagues. Well, I run ALSA. ALSA is one of the largest transport and mobility company in Europe. I worked for ALSA only for the last 30 years, and I run the company since 2016. I am now based in Madrid, but I had the chance alongside my career to live in such other countries as UK, Chile, or Portugal. The company I have I'm very proud to run is just to have in mind it's about 15,000 employees. It has almost 5,000 vehicles. Revenues prior to pandemic was almost 1 billion euros, and what we are more proud of is we carry more than 1 million passengers per day. Our main activity is buses and coaches, but we also have some trains, and we have some other related businesses related with mobility. So thank you again.
Thank you, Francisco. I love how Francisco says he's only been doing this for a couple of decades. That's a long time. Carlos, welcome. Tell everybody who you are, what you do.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this important meeting. I'm in charge of the direction of transport projects, and now I'm in charge. I will be in charge of the National Fund of Infrastructure, which is a trust uh, run by the National Bank of Public Works and Services, which is the biggest national development bank of Mexico. And the trust is, we call it FONADIN, Fondo Nacional de Infraestructura, is also concessionary of 45 toll roads, which is its revenue flow. With that, FONADIN gives maintenance to the toll road network, which is more than 5,500 kilometers. And also with the surplus, it finances sustainable infrastructure projects.
Carlos, welcome. And Julian, good to see you, Julian. Tell the world who you are. What do you do?
So I'm Julian Ware. I work for Transport for London, where I deal with the funding of major projects from the Corporate Finance Department. But I'm also the chair of the International Public Transport Union's Economics Committee, and I've been with them tracking the impact of the pandemic in economic terms for the last year or so.
Julian, great to have you. I just want to see all of our panelists, so you can see all of them there. Can you put your hand up if you feel that your sector is the most impacted by the global pandemic, or the most seriously in need of funding? Put your hand up if you believe your sector is the one. Okay, Julian got there first. All right, Julian, what's happened? Tell us the behind the scenes details of the transport that you're responsible for and what happened to make you feel that it is probably the most important sector that we should be paying attention to right now. And Feng, you were a little bit delayed there. I was surprised that you were not doing this, but you got there a little bit behind Julian. So Julian, you start, and then Feng, I'm going to get you to pick up. Julian,
Okay,
the
so let's talk about revenues and costs. And I'm
Mm.
really, my home base is London, so I obviously know what's happening with Transport for London, which runs the London Underground and the bus services and a number of other things as well. But I've been in contact with colleagues across Europe and indeed the rest of the world. What you see in the urban metro sector and the urban bus sector is a sudden fall in revenues of up to 80% in the case of many of the metros as their cities entered forms of lockdown. Buses have been less, perhaps 50 or 60% of revenues lost. Now, what distinguishes us from some of the other sectors is a decision that's been made by mayors, by governments, by the transport companies themselves to carry on providing the services. Services for the underground have very fixed costs. So you have a situation where you have revenues sharply down and no matching reduction in costs, and a sector which is part funded from those revenues, part funded by support from local and national governments. You've lost the revenues, you have to turn to the governments, and that's been really difficult.
I feel that really difficult is a euphemism, right? So what's your shortfall, and what are you asking for, and what did the government say?
Well,
If you can tell us.
it obviously depends on the size of your city, but it's very easy to get to numbers that are in the billions, sterling, euros, dollars, because if you take, say, Transport for London, we spend about £1 billion each month. We have about 60% of that was originally from the revenues. So if you start losing your revenues, you very, very quickly run through your reserves and you're running out of money. And then the politicians, we report to the Mayor of London, but we receive money from the national government. Politicians have to work out how they're going to pay for those costs.
Right. Let me go to Feng.
Difficult.
From the Civil Aviation Authority there, and which is really interesting from your civil aviation organization, excuse me, from your perspective, because we all know people mostly stop flying. But what does that look like behind the scenes? What does that look like from the industry perspective? Well, we were all trying not to travel. We were told not to travel. What happened?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would say our sector is one of the most heated sector. As you just mentioned, that the people are requested not traveling due to the pandemic. And what it means is, as you probably do not notice in the past, last year, our global sector carried 100,000 daily flights, flying on the sky, carrying 12 million passengers per day. And now, actually, in April last year, this number dropped to only 2% of the overall. Just a number I just give to you. And then we already have the number for the whole last year. 50% of the passenger and did not be able to carry it out and the overall. But for the international passenger, this number dropped to reduced 74% of the passenger for the international passengers. And that means, let's say, all our global sector now facing tremendous challenges to be survivor. This sector, including airlines, airports, aviation manufacturers, and also all the services support the operation. And that means also we lost $370 billion for global airlines, and in addition, 138 billion in loss for airports and also navigation service providers. Behind that, because like you said, people cannot travel for the business or for the leisure or for the even for education. And fortunately, what we did, the global sector last year, and Akio took a leadership to facilitate, to coordinate, and provide guidance to our global sector. That is, we ensure the air cargo continuously to be able to carry out the medical supplies and to bring the passenger back to their home when the pandemic started, and also to bring the foods and all the necessary goods to the destination really needed. And I would thank to the all information authorities and also all our industries, cooperation, and then they adapted very quickly to facilitate the movement of goods in order to ensure the supply chain still are working in the this unprecedented crisis. And then what happened, and what even more, let's say, important for our global sector, not only for the sector itself, but also for the global economy. Think about small island states. The lifeline is the connection with the rest of the world by air transport and bringing the tourism, bringing the business to their country. Now it's isolated. So I think what important is the government and also private sector should work together to strengthen the partnership, to help this industry, global industry, to recover and build resilient, and in order to continue to work and to fight this pandemic and for any future pandemic like this.
Fung, I am wondering, you've wrapped up the problem and the solution very neatly here. I am wondering from outside of the industry's perspective, when you're sharing those numbers that are so big, we're talking about billions here. What does that mean? Does that mean that routes will go, that airlines will go, that we won't be able to travel when we decide we want to travel again? We won't actually be able to travel because those airlines won't exist anymore, that the staff won't be trained up anymore. In a realistic passenger to passenger way, what does that mean?
And thank you for this excellent question. As I indicated, ACIO set up international standards. And also, our global sector is one of the sector most standardized. And then from our statistic, last year, we already see more than 40 airlines have bankrupted. This number, if now we see the pandemic still continues, this number will be increased. And then when airlines bankrupt, it's not that easy. Second day, you can establish new airlines after the pandemic. As I said, all our operation is for the personnel need to have the license, need to have recurring training, and in order to ensure you are transported safely and securely to the destination. So what means it's important for us, we need to support our sector be survive. And though our airlines and also all our sector now take a measures, self-helping measure by cutting some jobs and to be more efficient, and also take the leaves without the pay, and also to streamline their services, but it's not enough. Government need to make efforts, and policy-wise and also financial-wise, to support our sector to be survived.
Yeah.
And then
I'm going to
there is another.
I'm going to come back to that because you haven't said the B word, but I feel that you're talking about bailout here, and I know everybody on this plenary session has a thought about that. Fung, hold tight for a moment. I'm going to come back because when we get into bailout territory, I want everybody to be able to weigh in on that. Florent, this is interesting because you are heading up a company, and this company is very connected to transport. So, how has your business been impacted?
Well, unlike the airline industry, at Michelin, we are fortunate because we supply tires and different components in many different areas around the world and in different sectors. So we are manufacturing tires for aircraft, so that business is down. Sorry, but we also provide tires for mining, and that business is up. We also provide tires for cars, and that business is steady. And we supply tires in China, and China right now is recovering. So the breadth and the width of our offerings is actually protecting us. So even though the COVID has been a heavy hit on our revenue, it was only minus 15% globally compared to what we heard about several hundreds of billions loss in the airline industry sector. So at Michelin, we strongly believe that mobility is a human right, and therefore currently we live really a very difficult period because for sanitary reasons, we cannot have the mobility that human beings deserve. Now, I'm sure we will have a time to discuss that, but to answer directly to your questions, at Michelin, the fact that we are in many different activities is actually making us very resilient.
Yeah, I do want to come back to that because when I was talking to your team earlier, they were very positive about where we would be in the future regarding transport, even though right now there's not a lot of mass transport happening across the globe. I want to go to Francisco. Francisco, it's really good to have you in this conversation. I am thinking about what you have learned, what ALSA has learned from really experiencing the first global pandemic like COVID-19. There's never been anything quite like it before. We've had things like 9/11 when people stopped flying regionally. We've had MERS and SARS, and even Ebola when borders were closed, but not so broadly, and where people's lives were at stake. What did you learn? What are you learning right now?
Well, thank you for me. I think it would be easier to say what I haven't learned because everything has been different. But if I have to say a highlight of the situation when the crisis came up, it was how you feel, how vulnerable you are as a company. When you run a business, a company with some kind of businesses diversity that you think that you are a successful company in the world, in your country, and you see how in just 24 hours the figures drop dramatically and you have nothing to do at the moment. So, for example, you have said some figures that I would like to share what has happened in Spain. I think it's not far from some other figures. For example, in urban transport during 2020, number of passengers dropped 50% roughly, depending on the city, depending on the area. On the long haul services, we have dropped 80%. And during the first days of the lockdown in March and April, we had only 2% of passengers carrying our buses and coaches. So you see in just a very short time how the things are completely different. So what I have learned, responding your question, I think how you need your team, how you need to your employees, how you need to make a leader in that position in order to give clear instruction, clear guidelines to people who are waiting for your ideas. They are expecting that you are going to fix the problem in the next day, so that's impossible. So you have to rely on all of them. You can be working with the budget, with a strategic plan, with forecast, and nothing works at that moment. You have to start from scratch when something like that happens. Another important lesson, I think, you have always you have to listen to your customers. You have to know what your customers think on you, and how you can adapt and change and shift your product in order to give what are the priorities for your customer at every moment that are completely different. They change from price, from information. They change. They want safety and they want transparency on the company. I think it's also important that when you run a company, a huge company, the leader of the industry in a country, you are responsible in order to help the society. So you have to be, even in this case, helping with the transport to hospitals, loading material for sanitaries and so on. So you see how important your task could be for the society, even over on the financial issues that could be. Also important how the PTAs needs your vision and needs to be very clear from you what you need, how can you help to the PTAs in order to get the best of them. And finally, the same as I started this question is the value of the employees. A company needs every single employee that has in this. If they are not aligned with the project, if they don't trust on the project of the company, it's very, very difficult that you can give your company or to take away from this situation.
Francisco, as you were speaking, Julian was leaning forward, very interested. He literally leaned in to your conversation. Julian, what were you listening out for?
Well, I was thinking to myself, Femi, what have we learned? And the thing I would stress is there are two things going to happen. The first is what's going to happen in the short term. And almost in my sector, subsector, you can look at the scale of the lockdown restrictions and you can predict the demand levels. It's difficult to know what's happening with the lockdowns, how long the virus will carry on, etc. That's a relatively certain thing. What we don't know is what happens beyond that. Do people go back to using urban metros? Do they go back to flying? Do we work from home more often? That will become a different place. And that is a much more long-lasting changes that are potential in society. And we really don't know what those will be.
I want to go back to Carlos. Carlos, you have had a long career in transport and telecommunications, which right now seem to connect beautifully together, because when people aren't traveling, they were working out, how do I do my job? Not everybody is in this position, but how do I do my job without physically going into an office space? So from your position of knowing and understanding transport and telecommunications, where is the way forward? What are the lessons learned? What are the hard experiences that we've shared and that you've experienced with your customers that have pointed you to maybe sustainable mobility or a different way of even working or living using telecommunications as well?
Yes, as I agree on that, and I think we have discovered that we can keep on doing our activities like distant working, distant learning, and distant buying our food. And we have learned to use a lot more the telecommunication services, and that will change the demand when we start reactivating the economy. And the future demand will be different. And I think we could even manage the peak demand so that we could probably offer the services with less capacity, and that could help us to reduce costs in the transport sector. But the impact in the transport sector has to address us in the short term to survive the impact of the COVID, because it has been reduced so much, the demand and the revenues. And because of the distant establishing distance between customers, you cannot reduce the cost as much. Probably you can reduce, especially in trains, probably 10% the cost in order to keep on giving a basic service, but your revenues have been reduced more than 50%. So to survive, you will need bridge loans, and you will need technology to make it safer, the transport, and that will need investment. So for that, you will need not just bridge loans and reduce costs, but probably also support of the development banks of low cost uh, rate of interest, so that you can adapt to the new demand for the future. In the case of Fonadin, which we have the toll roads, the traffic has been reduced that much, especially in freight transport. In average, for the whole year, our revenues have been reduced about 25%. And in the long term, we think the toll roads will be financially sustainable. So what we are thinking also is to reactivate the economy, and so we can have loans with a long-term period to payment. And with that, we are thinking in reactivate projects and to create jobs, inducing more public works mainly in sustainable projects, and also in projects that will help to reduce the different development in the different regions, to have a, a more regional development, with more equilibrium. So from the toll roads network, we can finance or make it viable possible projects in the long term by giving some grants, so that with private investment and loans of the commercial banks, we can make viable different projects in sustainable projects, and also in projects that help us to reduce the difference between our regions. I think we have to work in those lines.
I'm going to push you, plenary speakers, because I want to think about, you're very aware of the situation you are in right now. How do you stabilize your industries? How are you stabilizing your industries? And then looking ahead and maybe even working greener. This feels like it's a big ask, but where are you right now? Fang, you start.
Okay, so I think you are right. First of all, we need to stabilize our global sector. And then the first thing, I think the companies, these entities themselves, first should make efforts to reduce the cost, to be more efficient, and also to find a way how to be survive. And then government support, and also financially and policy-wise, as I already indicated, is also very important as a last resort. And in that sense, an ICAO issued a new economic and finance measures as guidance to our member states for them to consider in order to support our sector. Then there are still lots of uncertainties and also questions on how our industry can be more resilient and to be also recovered. For that part, I would like to see that is challenging, no doubt about that, and an unprecedented challenge. But it's also great opportunity for us. So as you know, in future, and certainly some pattern of the business and for also travel will be changed. And then that is one of the elements I think is very important. Passenger would like to be contactless and also more efficient to have this kind of travel experiences. I think that's also very important for us to think about accelerate digitalization of our operations. And then also great opportunity for us to be more sustainable, that which is by introducing more quickly alternative fuels, which can reduce the emissions and also create the more opportunities for business. And also another element is for the electrical, let's say, equipment and aircrafts, and to use more like energy sufficient, efficient, and green energy for our airlines, for our aircrafts. So all this need the private sector to actively engage in investment. And also, of course, government should incentivize this kind of activities, give the opportunity for our sector to rebuild greener and more sustainable. And for that part, I think airlines already started like retire some non-efficient aircraft from the fleet, and also now looking for more greener aircrafts, which also give the incentivize for the manufacturers as a market for them to do it.
Fang, this is just a very quick, I'm just going to ask you very quickly. I want you to come back to me very quickly. Are you seeing any part of the industry right now building back greener right now, this month? Or is it too soon?
For time being, this first quarter, I'm not that optimistic for this quarter. Hopefully, let's say
Okay.
with the vaccine and the rollout, quickly, and with also all the measures taken by the government as globally harmonized, then I think that we can help our industry and travel come back quicker.
Florent,
I think in the short term,
Julian, you go first. Go ahead.
I was going to say, in the short term, we've moved the dial a bit during the current crisis. We moved the dial a bit away from public transport and towards private transport. And in general, that is not green. So the immediate effects, all right, emissions overall down, but more private transport relatively. In the medium to long term, in London, for instance, we'd like to electrify our bus fleet. And for that, we need a financially stable future. So the investment uncertainties that a number of panelists have talked about are quite serious in terms of improving and greening our city to go forwards. We have managed to make a number of changes to roads, to introduce cycle routes and things like that. And I think that that's been a positive. And you'll see a number of other cities going down those same paths as London.
Florent, I learned something from your team this week, and it's a phrase, ecosystemic approach. It's relevant to what I just asked, but would you unpack that for us? Because I feel like that's Michelin speak. What does that mean?
Yes.
But it's looking to the future.
Yeah, maybe just to comment. First of all, I don't think we can aim at stabilizing things. Really, we are in a world that is moving very fast. Technology, we share all the same information. We have human beings everywhere. The human population is growing, and we have a lot of challenges in front of us. And the technology brings us information simultaneously. So therefore, we react the same way. And therefore, this amplifies a lot the volatility of our markets. So instead of trying to stabilize things, we are preparing everyone at Michelin to be at ease with complexity and to be at ease with volatility and basically to adapt to any circumstances. So I think that's when we project ourselves in the future, I don't think stabilization is a word we would use. Now, back to your question about, now we live in a huge transition. We're moving from what's called the industrial area into a new area. And we are right now in a transition phase. And we were in that transition phase before the COVID. What the COVID has done is has just accelerated trends that were already there. The growing number of the population, the scarce natural resources, the global warming, the issue about density in urban areas, etc. Many, many different things. So in the transition, there are many turbulence. When you are in an aircraft, you know when you move from one mass of air to another one, that transition period is very turbulent. And I think the world right now is experiencing that. And this would last for many years. But we have now, with the technology and the human intelligence, we have the capability to handle that transition. So I'm very optimistic. But the transition and where we project ourselves is in a very complex world. And therefore, the issue is very complex. And I don't think one company alone will have a solution. I believe in the fact that it is a joint action to solve all the issues we have to solve to move into a world that is better for humanity and better for our children. We need a collective action between the private sector, the public sector. We need finance corporations to finance the transition, to accept the fact that they cannot finance on the old business model, but they have to take risk to accompany the transition into new type of business model. I believe in the fact that we need to have private corporations with public corporations work together. We need between private and private working together. We need to have large companies working with small companies. So basically, we need to have an ecosystemic approach rather than having a siloed approach. And I think with this complex world, we believe in that at Michelin, and we want to entertain more activities to create more links with many different type of corporations, public sectors, but also there is a huge, for example, in the transition, there is a huge undertaking on training. How do you train millions of people that have been grown in certain way of thinking and doing things into the new way of thinking and doing things? And this is a massive undertaking. So if we want to do that, one corporation, one state will not be sufficient. And the world now, whether we like it or not, is already globalized. So I believe in a journey. So in urban area, of course, public transportation is obviously mass transportation is compulsory. But when you live in remote area, it is uneconomical to create public transportation for all. So you will need a blend between a private transportation and connecting to mass transportations. You need to have systems where you can move from a bike into a car, into a bus, into a train, into a plane, into a boat. So we need to organize this complexity. And now the good news is the technology is there. So it is now, we need to rethink the way we work together. And that's why we believe in ecosystems.
Florent, I'm going to come back to you, but I find it really intriguing because it's often the public sector that are trying to entice the private sector to collaborate. And here you are, the private sector saying, we can't be in silos. So that is fascinating. I want to come back and ask you what you think about bailouts, but I will hold on to that thought for a moment. Carlos, are you in a situation where you're able to stabilize the losses that have been incurred due to COVID-19? And then think about How do you build back better? Where are you in that thought and action process?
I think we should think in a long term. we should solve the short term crisis, thinking in the long term evolution. So in order to solve the short term, you have, as you say, you have to reduce costs, you have to introduce technology, and you have to give a more distant service in transport because of in the future. So for that you will need investment. But as the panelists have said, this world will keep growing, and there is a paradox because in between private service, private transport, and public transport. In the case of underdeveloped countries, the people with less revenues, they are obliged to use the public transport, and they live with some important distances, and they cannot evolve to use more individual transport, although the individual transport is the one that has revenues. The users have revenues, and they are willing to pay in order to build more toll roads, urban toll roads, and they make it viable, financially viable, those projects. And so we are running in a paradox that with the revenues of the private transport, we are building more and more infrastructure, mainly for the cars. So and it's on the wrong path to have a sustainable transport. So we need to force that the users that are causing the negative externalities can finance the sustainable projects. And one way is in a certain way is what Fonadin is doing. The toll roads are paying to finance the train projects and the mass transit projects, and even they are helping to make viable projects not just in the main cities but also in medium cities. And I think in the future probably we won't be thinking in living in very compact cities with huge buildings, because we have found that we don't need to be together. We can work in distance, and we can manage to work in long distance. And so I think the medium cities will have a better future, and instead of keeping concentrating in big and big and bigger cities.
I can see that Fung is making notes. Fung, what's on your notepad? Share it with us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking, let's say, I'm still very optimistic for the future travel, though we are now facing greatest difficulties for our global sector. Like some panelists already mentioned, travel is the human right. People would like to travel. So now for this near future, or for time being, I would like to encourage the governments to have harmonized, consistent measures to tackle this COVID-19 issue in order to allowing and facilitate travel and when they need travel. So, and for that sense, I would like to share with you, Akio, we issued a so-called CAT report, give the guidance and recommendations for the global sector and also for all the member states in the world to consider to follow this kind of procedure and protocols, and in order to minimize the risks. And also our guidance is risk-based and no one size fits all. It should take into account the special context of each country and each region. And we also issue the so-called public health corridor and this kind of protocol and measures for the member states to follow. And then for the recovery, I would like to encourage not only government, but also private sector to take aviation as a priority for investment. as just mentioned, aviation is the enabler. And also, most important, our sector is global sector. So we need to have harmonized this kind of measures and also the standards and protocols to follow. And then it's important not only because our sector, because you invest not only for our sector itself, but because the whole supply chain I just indicated. And like travel, like other sectors relying on the travel. So that's why it's important for the government and also private sector to take that into consideration as a priority sector to invest. And then when you invest, please invest the greener, let's say, technology and help our global sector to be more green.
Fang, what does that mean? I just want to make sure that we're not just saying the word green. And what does that mean in the airline industry? Because the airline industry has had a difficult relationship with being green, just because the very nature of flying is it creates some issues regarding the environment. What does that mean, being green, now that you're in a situation where the industry is in a dire situation and you have to build back? What does being
As you
green
know,
mean?
our sector as the airlines, we have produced around 2% of our emissions globally every year. Okay, and then these emissions are produced mostly because the fuels and also because other activities, related activities. And we already have the alternative fuels be used by some airports, some airlines. But the commercialization and deployment of these alternative fuels need to have further work in order be able to faster deploy it and accessible and affordable by airlines, by passenger. That's one thing. And another thing is in the engine. If we have the electrical and or hybrid, this kind of a new technology, which can help to reduce the emission, that is also the goal. So that's also, I think, government and the private sector can invest. Like a car, you have a electric car, and the engine for the airplane can also have this kind of electric battery, and for new energy to be used. So this is a new area. On top of that, as you know, we're talking about the smart city, and there is a unmanned aircraft or flying taxi and drones, which can also help to transport at the last mile to the destination. So this is also new technology. And also, I'm talking about other activities as indicated, digitalization and contactless. And this also, and when you go through the airport, if we have the contactless and by new technology, we can have them more like a greener, this kind of new technology introduced by face recognition and without the paper used.
Okay.
All this can be greener.
Right. But no shortage of ideas there, but a shortage of money. I want to go back to Francisco. You may remember that Francisco is a CEO of Spain's leading passenger transport company. Francisco, I am thinking, bearing in mind the experience of the past year, what advice would you give to national governments, to local governments, in order to support their transport services? What would you say that a company like yours needs?
Well, I would go with that just in a minute, but I would like also to say that companies are also responsible for a lot of things, and I think, as I think it was Florent earlier said, I think it's a time not to stabilize the company, but it's a time to revisit our strategy, to revisit our product, to revisit our company. So I think companies can do a lot of things in order to be in a better position and to help administration and PTA. So, and now I think answering more in deep on your question. I think the first thing we as a company need from the administration is to be able to launch a campaign to get the trust of our customer back in the public transport sector. That's very important. When the crisis began, I think most of the messages we receive as a society is don't use public transport, it's dangerous, so you have to use private car. That's not sustainable. So now I think we have technology enough in order to protect our customer. We need from administration to give a clear message to the society to give back on that. And if we need to be more ambitious on the administration, I think there are some kind of ideas or some kind of things that I consider that are difficult to put in place in the short term. So we have to go for them, thinking in 2030 and so on. But I think what really need right now is what we call quick wins. We need something that could have impact in a very short time. For example, we need to change some mobility laws in order to, as I said, to discourage the use of private cars in cities. We need mandatory transportation plans for employees in the industrial areas in the near of the cities. We need the use of the technology in order to provide transport on demand, in order to be more efficient. And if we want to, that could be done in a very short time, and I'm sure that could have a significant impact on mobility and sustainability. But not only that, we need to go further, and we need to make plans for the long terms. And what I would ask to the administration is to be brave on these kind of things. For example, now transportation sector will have access to a lot of funds coming from, in my case, from the European Union in order to revisit the company to help with the situation. What we need is that funds should be used really to transform the company. Also, it's very important to have collaborative plans and agreement between public and private sectors. So it's not only a word. We have to work in real plans between private and public. So I think that's the main messages I would send to administrations.
Panelists, I am going to now go to the speed round and bring in some of the questions that have been percolating from our virtual audience. Julian, I'm going to start with you. This question is from Marty Hooked. Marty says, given the fact the pandemic crisis and the need of preparing for the climate deal, how much subsidy do you need from the government for renewing the public transport infrastructure? Julian.
I think it's about sustainability. I talked about short and longer term. In the longer term, we need to spend about as much as we've been spending in the past to keep our infrastructure. If people are going to travel less, the idea that we might all work from home a bit more, then that's a gap that needs to be filled. And we need to decide which group, whether it's the taxpayer or the road user as suggested, will fill the gap. So I think there is a need for maintaining levels of spend. I think we've got much more cautious in London about big expansions of the network, though I think we would like to do the electrification of the bus fleet that discussed earlier. And those issues that I talk about London, I think are relevant in many other cities as well.
A question for you, Fang, and a very quick reply, please. But it's a very practical question. This is from Mansour. Mansour, I love your question. Do you see major redesigning of the interior circulation of aircraft in the cabins, and also the way the space is arranged so the planes can promote more privacy but also safety while flying? Fang.
For time being, we do not have this kind of answer from our airlines and also from the manufacturer. But I think the client needs is always the primary elements for our industry to consider.
Thank you. A quick question. I'm going to ask this question to Carlos and also Francisca, so you can share this question. I will read it so that slowly, so that you all get to hear it. You both get to hear it. This one is from Sergio. Thank you, Sergio. The reality of large cities where there is a concentration of public policies is different to medium and small cities. The pandemic generated a whole stock of demands, failed systems that were no longer efficient, and inverted some values, partly motivating light modes, but also reinforcing the use of individual transport. So here's the question. What is the perspective of this immense universe of small and medium sized cities outside of the eyes of politicians regarding funding? So I think what Sergio is saying, small cities are different from medium cities. Everyone's got a different kind of need. Carlos, do you want to give us your perspective on that just briefly?
Yes, I think that in recent years, this strategy has been, let's do a urban development mainly in big cities and dense cities instead of dispersed cities and low-level cities. So a lot of buildings have been growing and in the main cities, and that is creating a concentration of demand on transport and on facilities. And it says, well, it's more efficient to have the people concentrated. But I think with these results of the pandemic, we have learned that we don't need to be concentrated. So I think that in the long term, the big cities can be less concentrated in so huge buildings. And also, I think that in the future, a lot of people would like to live in medium cities, which are not far from big cities, but they can work in distant working and have services in all these medium cities. And in the future, I think we should think more in the medium-sized cities.
Let me just share this question also with Francisco, this difference between small and medium cities and their needs in the current climate that we're living in. Francisco, your take.
Yes, I think it's a very appropriate question, and I think if you bear in mind that, for example, Spain have only two cities, over 2 million inhabitants in a city. Only Madrid and Barcelona have more population. So most of the cities in Spain are medium and small size with a lot of places. And it's real that with the pandemic, behavior of people are changing, and some of the people are moving from big cities to some other places. This is a challenge for the country, but I see an opportunity for model transport as a coach and buses to cover this demand that is coming, because with this capillarity that is going to be needed in the country, this can only be fit through buses and coaches. I don't see that we can provide a network of train or some other place. And it's very important for a country the term cohesion, in order to have all the facilities in all the rural areas and the small cities. I think transport should be one of the three pillars of the well-being of a society, together with the health and together with the education. I think transport is very important in order to ensure the cohesion of the population. So I see more an opportunity than a risk with this change of behavior.
Julian taught me something this week, and I was really, really shocked. As you can tell from my accent, I'm a Londoner. And Julian was telling me how much it costs when people work from home. Julian, will you just want to share that stat, that figure, because I think it will surprise people. A day at home costs how much to the transport system in London?
London's transport revenues are £5 to £6 billion a year. So if everybody worked from home one day a week, that would be £1 billion that would need to be found from somewhere else. As I talked earlier, costs are relatively fixed, less so for buses, definitely fixed for the tube. Revenues are variable. Where do you find that money from?
I'm going to go back to Florent. Florent, each of our plenary speakers, I know that in an ideal situation, they would like to have a bailout, right? They've had a horrible year and people aren't using their transport systems, their modes of transport, and they would like money to come from the government. What is your perspective on bailouts?
Uh, there is this magic notion that government have money that people don't have. Government money is coming from people. It's just a question of timing. So the but I believe in bailouts. Really now.
Florent, I want you to see the panel because everyone is smiling right now. Everyone's like, oh, Florent got the tough question. Also, Florent, I want you to be very honest. So they're smiling and enjoying your discomfort. Florent, continue.
Yeah, because at the end there is in the public in general there is this notion that government have a sort of safe with magic money available somewhere. The only thing that government have is the ability to get debt on behalf of the future generation that they can borrow money for the future. So that's the mechanism of banking, financing, etc., which is I have a pool of money, I take savings and I reassign this. And sometimes I can make loans where I pretend I have the savings, but actually I don't have them, and I can still borrow money. And if I don't have the savings, then I print the money. So the government's money are very useful to help transitions. So to say, I am going to force some investment in some areas to force the society to move in one direction. So that's why governments, by the way they rule things and by the way they finance, they're going to help the society to move from one way of doing things to another way of doing things. So, and bailouts are very necessary right now because of the sanitary situations, corporations have been in real stress. Now, I believe that bailouts should be used very wisely to help transforming. It's not bailout because companies are in difficulties. There are companies that were in difficulties before the crisis. And bailing out those corporations may not help them, actually. I believe in the fact that industries, corporations are living bodies, and they sometimes need to have difficulties to realize that they need to change and modify things and be more efficient. So I believe in competition. I believe in the free enterprise, and I believe in the basically the economic mechanism of private and public. So bailouts are necessary. And for me, bailouts should be directed in helping transforming the society.
Thank you, Florent. You got the last word. Florent, Fung, Francisco, Carlos, Julian. We were just getting started. I know there was a good debate to be had there, but I will let you take that away into your various fields of work and wish you continued success. And hopefully that you'll be involved in sustainable mobility going forward in 2021. We really appreciate you being part of this forum. Thank you very much, speakers. Appreciate you. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, delegates,
Thank you.
for your excellent questions. Appreciate you too. Thank you very much.